Okay, so in the last lecture we discussed that we didn't want to have to define our variables every time we need a new date picker, and we didn't want to do separate loops to populate the years and set up the event listeners for each and every different date picker input fields. And that's why we wanted to shift to a blueprint model to ES6 classes. And this is what we're going to do now. We're going to create our first ES6 class. So let's just go ahead and create a new file, which we're going to call datepicker.js. And in this file, we're going to say class datepicker and curly braces. Now, if ES6 classes are new to you, I have a series here on YouTube where I review Udemy web development courses, and in one of those reviews, in review number 2, I review Jonas Schmettmann's JavaScript course. I highly recommend that course. He goes into great detail about ES6 in general, classes, object-oriented programming, loads of topics that you need to know if you want to be a JavaScript developer. I'm not going to go into any detail, but I try to explain as much as possible in order to help you understand what exactly I'm doing. So we're creating a class. This will be the blueprint of our object, and every class has a constructor function, and this is where you can pass in details, properties. So you can put here argument 1 or argument 2, whichever you need, but usually if you have more than 2-3 arguments, best is to just pass in an object and then assign the object's properties to the class instances properties. Now let's just take a look at what properties we will need in order to create this blueprint. We will need a unique ID, we will need a start date, and we will need an end date. Later on we will need a default year and month and the current year and month, but just to make these date pickers auto-generate by highlighting the input fields, we don't need these just yet. Also, we can just ignore this logic for now. So if we want to go back to the text editor, we can just say that every time there is a new object created, make this object's unique ID equal to the object ID we're passing in. Then we can say this start date, so this instance's start date should be equal to the start date we're sending via the object, and this end date should be equal to, you can guess, the end date we are sending in. Now this alone will not be enough, obviously. We also need to create a method to add the actual HTML element, and the way we do is we create a method, and in that method we will save the datepicker HTML markup as a string, and then we're going to convert it into an element and add it to the DOM tree. So the way you define methods on a class is very simple. You just have to declare it, just simply enter the name and parentheses and curly braces for the method's body. And what we need here is a constant, which we're going to call HTML. Now, you've probably seen that I use a lot of constant, and if you're coming from an ES5 world where you use vars, you probably wonder when is it the right time to use constant, and when is it the right time to use let, for example. Now, if your code is like really granular and modular, so basically you've got methods and functions that does one or maximum two very, very specific jobs, more often than not, I would say 80% of the times you will use const. The very few instances you will need a let, meaning the variables you create need to be modified, is, for example, when you use an iterator like a for loop, or use a counter for a while loop, or if there's any like a string you want to manipulate. Let's say you are manipulating a URL or a text output, or if there's any which is part of this, if there's any conditional output, and then you probably need to just first declare let's say let text, and then if something is true, then the text will be equal to A. If that's false, then text will be equal to B. So in these cases you need let, but more often than not const is just fine. So especially for arrays and objects, which don't really get modified. So the constant HTML, I'm going to use template literals here. Let's give it some space, and I'm going to grab the index HTML. Let's just close these Datepickers here so it's more manageable, and we're going to also clean up this HTML file a little bit. So you see it's 147 lines. Now we're going to grab the from Datepicker, cut it to the clipboard, delete the extra lines, and the to Datepicker can just be simply deleted. We don't need to explicitly insert it here, and you see it's reduced to 33 lines. So this file has really nicely been trimmed, and what we're going to do here, just add the whole markup, right? So we got the whole markup here, and obviously it looks a bit distorted because I'm way too zoomed in. And what we need to do, if you look at this, we cannot explicitly put the ID here anymore. So what we're going to say, remember, we're passing it in here. So we access it by this keyword and the unique ID. So we quickly, in this template literal, we're jumping out to JavaScript, and we're going to say this unique ID has to be the ID of the Datepicker. Now we've got this whole markup, but obviously this is just a string, so this won't be rendered to the DOM. What we need to do here is add a line of code here to edit, to grab this HTML string and add it to the DOM. But before we go ahead, I thought it would be convenient excuse me, to save the input element into the Datepicker instances properties. So we're going to say input element is equals to document get element by ID, and the ID is what? Again, it's very easy to access it, this unique ID. Now, why am I doing this? I'm going to show you why I want to do that. Because remember, it used to be here. So what I want to do is I want to be able to access this input field, go up one level to the form group, and insert it as a last element of the form group. That's what I want to achieve. And it's just easier to grab this input field if we saved it as a property, because now I can just go down here at the end of the add HTML method. Remember, we're still in this purple curly braces, so we're still inside this add HTML method. And all I need to do is just say this input element, parent element. So we're going up to the form group, and there's a handy JavaScript method that is insert adjacent HTML. This takes on two parameters. One is the location. So one of these, we will need the before and, so just before the closing tag. And what are we adding? We're adding in our HTML string, which is this very long string, right? Can I close it? Yeah, I can close it, then it's more manageable to see what I'm doing, right? And also one more thing we can do that's going to be handy. So if we don't just save the input element, but we also the Datepicker div, Datepicker div. Now at this stage, when we're just constructing it, it's not ready, it's not available. So we have to define it as null, because it's only available once we added it to the DOM. So once we added it to the DOM, we can say this Datepicker div equals document get element by ID, and the ID, remember what the ID is. The ID is the same as this one here. Right? So we've got our blueprint, we've got a method, the add HTML, and now we just need to make sure that it actually renders to the DOM. So if you recall, what we used to do here is we used to define number of event listeners, and as a result of the event listener, the Datepicker that was hard-coded was shown or hidden. Now we don't just need to show and hide, we actually need to add it to the DOM tree, so it will be a little bit different. And what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to comment most of it out, not going to delete everything. Why did this happen? Not going to delete everything because we might just reuse some of this code, so it's good to keep it there as a reference if we don't like typing too much. So what we need to do is create some event listeners for our input field. So why don't we just go ahead and yeah, we need the from Datepicker input. We're just going to select them. This is the document get element by ID, and the ID was just simply from, right? Yeah, the ID was just from. Then we need the same for the to Datepicker. And the best way to save code when we, I just saw that I did a spelling mistake here. So the best way to mass create event listeners is to put them in an array and just iterate over them. Let the computer do the job. So let's create that array. It's going to be called Datepicker inputs, and this will be an array that has the from Datepicker input and the to Datepicker input. Now this, at one point this will be dynamic as well. We won't be explicit about this, but let's just go one step at a time. So you got this array, and let's just iterate over it. A very convenient method is the for each, meaning we're going to do the same action for each element of the array, regardless of its values. So very simple. A Datepicker inputs for each, and this takes on a function that can have an element. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use ES6 syntax. So I'm just going to pass in this element. It's automatically passed in. I just have to give it a name, and I'm going to call it Datepicker input in singular. It's very good to be very explicit with these variable names, these parameter names, because if you come back a couple of weeks later and you just simply, many people, what they do is just put an E here, or an L, or an L1. It's going to be very confusing, especially if you do some nested array methods, and then you have to put an L2, L3, and then you have to compare L1 equals L3. It's just going to be too confusing. So I'd rather make it very, very explicit what kind of element I'm dealing with. And so what do we need to do with this date picker? So you'll see that if I console log out, so just to show you what exactly I'm getting here as I'm iterating over this array. I'm getting a null. Oh yeah, because get element by ID doesn't need the hashes. There you go. So yeah, these are the two inputs that I'm iterating over. So all I need to do is remember what was our main event listener was the focus, right? So where is our focus event listener? Can't see it. Oh, here we go. So we're just gonna grab it from here. And add it here, uncomment this section. And remember, we can't just show it and unshow it because it's not available in the DOM tree. So instead, what we need to do is we need to instantiate this class that we created. And how that is done is basically you create a new constant. You can name it whatever. I'm going to call it Datepicker. And this Datepicker will be equal to a new instance of the Datepicker class. It's not being imported automatically because we're not exporting it. So when you do modules and you want to import functionalities or entire JS files, you need to make sure that you export it the following way. This is one of the ways. There are other ways. But when you want to export an object, for example, this is how you do it. And VS Code is smart enough that when you type it in here, it recognizes where it needs to be imported. So there's an import statement added to the top, right? And remember, the constructor requires an object to be passed in. So let's just go ahead and put an object here. Drop down to the next line, and let's just check out. We need an ID, a start date, and an end date. So let's just create these. ID, it's going to be something, start date. Let's just grab it from here. And we need an end date. Let's grab this one from here. So it's good we left some of this code here. It's easier to copy. Now the ID needs to be dynamic. So we can't just hard code here anything. We need to extract the ID from these input fields. And it's very easy because as we iterate over these input fields, we can save the ID. You see, I'm using different convention for the IDs. I'm calling this unique ID. I'm calling here ID. I'm calling here ID and capital ID, just to show you. You could name them the exact same way. I'm just showing you that which IDs are different variables, properties, etc. So that you know which one you're free to name whichever way you want and which one have to be bound the exact same way. So this ID will be equal to the Datepicker input field, so the one we are getting via this iteration of this array. Then there's a handy method called getAttribute, and the attribute we're after is the ID. So we just pass the attribute name in as a string. And then we just need to pass in this ID that we're extracting here. Right, so this creates a new Datepicker object for us. So why don't we console log this Datepicker as it's being created after the focus. It's not available here, so I have to type it out. Right. So you got an error. Cannot use import statement outside a module. Yeah. So if you're trying to import, export, etc., and you're working with more than one JavaScript file, you just have to put here type module. Then everything will be perfect. There's one more error, and it's the fact that the auto import hasn't put the JavaScript file extension, but I think now we should be okay. This relates to, I believe, to this event listener, so we can just ignore it, but you could see that here our new object has been created. Now the input field is highlighted correctly, so we save that. The Datepicker div is not showing as null, so that needs to be fixed. You see the unique ID is from, and start date end date seems to be fine. Let's look at what's wrong with this Datepicker div. Datepicker div null. Element by ID. Yeah. So the problem is that obviously we're not adding it to the DOM tree. So how do we add it? Remember, we have this method, the add HTML method on this object. So all we need to do is just call the Datepicker and add HTML. And now we should have that Datepicker as well. Let's clear this. Yes, so we got the Datepicker div as a property, and now it has a proper value, but it's still not showing. And the reason for that is, if you remember, we changed the logic. It used to be there and it was hidden, and we've shown it. So the default for the Datepicker is, where are you? It's a display none, and we're showing it by udiv show. Now what you can do is you can either remove that display none as a default property and rename this to udiv hide and put display none important here, or you can just leave it this way and copy this property over into the Datepicker class. I think this should fix it now, finally. Yeah, but obviously remember we get that issue again with the propagation. So I need to do is, when Datepicker input, as we iterate over as a last step, so outside this focus event listener, we can add our one of these stop propagator, and it's this one here. This one is on the input element. Let's copy and edit here, and this should remain the same. I think it's not much we need to change. Let me see what's happening now. Yeah, 2 showing up automatically for some reason. Oh yeah, because the close still just listens to the from, so we'll fix that later. Now what happens if we click on the If we click on the Datepicker, it still propagates. So we need to make sure that we also stop propagating inside, and we can do it after the Datepicker has been created. And here we will need the Datepicker, and we need to add remember, we need to refer to this Datepicker div, because that's where we want to stop the propagation, Datepicker div. And then we're going to copy our stop propagation event listener. It should be this one here. I mean, it's just a stop propagation. I could have copied the other one as well. Here we go. Uncomment this. So you can see there's an event listener inside an event listener, which is probably not the best practice. You could make a separate function for creating a Datepicker and then put the event listener there, but obviously the Datepicker has to be available in the DOM tree in order to add the event listener. So that's just kind of a workaround, and I believe that if now I click anything on this, it won't disappear. Now, but what the issue we're facing now is, see if I click a lot of times here, look how many Datepickers I will get. This is Datepicker ID from, Datepicker ID from, Datepicker ID from. So I get as many Datepickers as many times I'm focusing. So it looks like then when you're dynamically adding an element, you need to make sure that you're only adding it once. So we need to come up with a way of checking if that Datepicker has been added or not. And we can just create a new array that we can call activated date. I have serious typing problems today. Activate Datepickers, and obviously we're always going to start with an empty array. And when we're focusing, we have to check if to the current input, if there's any Datepicker already been rendered to the DOM, and maybe it's just hidden. So we need to check if we have an active one, and we can check it using an array method, the find array method, which returns the element that was found based on a criteria we give, or otherwise it will return undefined. Now, it might return null. Either way, it will be a false value. It doesn't really matter which one it is. So we can say the active should be equal to activated Datepickers find and activated. It's automatically passed in this parameter, so the element we're iterating over is automatically passed in. And what we need to check if is the activated okay, activated seems to create some code we don't like. We want the parameter, so we have to check if the activated UID, because the activated will be a Datepicker object. So we have to check if the activated's unique ID equals to the ID of the input field. Now, if that active Datepicker doesn't exist yet, we need to create it. We need to create it, we need to add the HTML, and we need to add this stop propagation event listener, right? But if it's already there, Only thing we need to do is get that date picker, and remember that this date picker here, so the date picker, when we create it as a, we save it as a date picker variable. So we access the date picker div via the date picker variable, but here we will access it via the active because we haven't created it and we haven't saved it in the date picker. We have it saved it in the active when we iterated over the active date picker. So there we have to grab the active dot date picker div dot class list dot add, and we're gonna add the u div show class. So if I'm correct, let me comment this out. If I'm correct, this should prevent us from creating multiple date pickers. So let's just see, there's no date picker there just yet. Date picker from is there. udiv shown disappeared. Still a new one is created. And we're going to check why that is. And of course, you need to add it to the activated array, so it's not going to magically fly in. So as soon as you create the date picker, maybe even before you add it as an HTML, activated date pickers push date picker. Right, let's refresh and open this up again. Oh, okay, I accidentally. So now we can see we have the date picker here. Now the udiv show disappears. Now the udiv show is added. Udiv show disappears. Udiv show added. Same goes for the to from group. It's not there. It's been added with the udiv show. Let's click out. Oh yeah, the closing doesn't work for the to. So for now we can just, okay, let's just go ahead and fix this closing. What we need to do here is simply, we can use this activated date because array, we need each and every element. So for the active, and we're going to do the following for each element. We're going to get the active. Actually, let's just grab this code, save us some typing. Where is the class list code? Here. It's literally the same as there, with difference that we need to remove udiv show. Now this should make sure that we only, let me see how many two we have now. Date picker, there's only one, right? And it's only just that class is toggled, you can see with the purple highlight. So that's good. Well, this is obviously not ideal because you could also do some checks. For example, if there are many date pickers, then it's obviously you just want to hide the ones that actually have the udiv show. So what you can do here is access the same div, the date picker div, and there's a property called ClassName, which returns the class name as a string, all the class names, and then you can just say index of this udiv show and it's greater than -1. So basically it's part of the string. It starts where the string starts. And in that case, just remove. Let me see if it works. Yeah, it seems to work. Now we also want one of them to be hidden when the other one is clicked. And for that, we would need to reuse this functionality. So it's best to just create a separate function. Let's say call it close date pickers, and let's just put it somewhere here. We can put it even up here, it doesn't matter. Again, ES6 close date pickers, right, equals to a function which will do the following. We'll close the activated date pickers, and we're using it in the event listener for once, and we want to be the first step of showing any date picker is to close anything that's open. Right, let me see if it works as it's intended. Yeah. Do we have any errors? No, I don't see any error. Now remember, the goal was to be super scalable and to be able to add a new input field, call it whatever. Let's say call it holiday start. Select the holiday start date, and the ID is holiday start. But as you can see, it doesn't work for the holiday start, so it's not as dynamic as we would like it to be. And the reason for that is obviously that we're still hard coding the input fields. So what I would suggest is to make this dynamic as well. So let's start with an empty date picker inputs, and let's just collect all the date picker inputs dynamically, and we can do it by creating a new variable. Let's call it date picker input elements, and this will be equal to document get element by class name. So which is the class name all of them share is this date picker input. You can see it's everywhere, so why don't we just copy it. Date picker input. This will be a node collection, and we're going to convert this node collection to an array so we can iterate over them, because we need to iterate over them here. We don't want to change the existing code. So what we're going to do is just a simple for loop, and you see I have to use let here. So the I will be equal to 0, and we're going to up until the date picker input elements length, not including the obviously the last number, because it's 0 indexed, and each time we're increasing the iterator, and all we need to do is just get the date picker inputs, this array here, the one we want to iterate over here, date picker inputs, and we're going to push a new element, and the element is this Datepicker elements node collection, this current element. So this in theory should make it super dynamic. So remember, I'm not explicitly defining any variable with the Datepicker inputs, and it should in theory work for all of them. So let's just put on the focus, let's just put a console log. Let's say at the end, let's console log all the activated Datepickers, right? And you will see that now I've got to a point where if I need a new Datepicker, I can just simply create it in the markup. I can say and, select the end date, and its ID is going to be and. This is really the only crucial for the JavaScript part. And now let's just clear it. You're going to see that I've got a Datepicker, and this is the holiday, and another Datepicker, which is the holiday end, holiday start. Got the to and got the from. See? No matter how many times I click, it's just these Datepickers here. So the holiday start, holiday to, holiday from, holiday end. And in terms of the Datepickers, there's just one Datepicker in every form group. So it got into a point where we really made it dynamic. You see, we don't need to go into the JavaScript when we want to have a Datepicker. All we need to do is just index HTML file, just create a new input, and leveraging the power of ES6 classes, we've got a Datepicker ready. Obviously, it's lacking most of the functionality the Datepicker has to have, but that's coming in the next lesson. In next lesson, we're going to, you see, we lost the ability to display the years, but in the next lesson, we're going to take care of rendering the correct years and rendering the correct months that are within the constraint of the blueprints start and end date. So that's coming up in the next lesson.